The war had been burning for 63 years. Talvik stood at the observation window of the diplomatic cruiser and watched the remains of what had once been the Iridian colony world of Sithara. The planet was black now, not the black of night or shadow, but the black of death. The oceans had boiled away decades ago. The atmosphere was poison. Somewhere down there, beneath the ash and the ruin, 17 billion Iridian souls had once lived and laughed and raised their children. Now there was nothing. He pressed his long, pale fingers against the cold glass and felt the familiar weight of grief settle into his chest. He had been born during the war. He had grown up during the war. Every memory he had was colored by it. The sound of evacuation alarms, the taste of rationed food, the faces of friends who shipped out to the front lines and never came back. The war between the Velshara Dominion and the Iridian Confederacy had started over a border dispute, a single contested star system. It seemed almost funny now, in the darkest possible way. Two of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy had spent 6 decades destroying each other because neither would back down over a patch of empty space. The Velshara were winning. They had been winning for the last 20 years, slowly and steadily grinding the Confederacy into dust. Their fleets were larger. Their industrial base was deeper. Their soldiers were bred for obedience and trained from birth. The Iridians were clever and proud, but cleverness and pride did not stop orbital bombardments. They did not rebuild shattered fleets. They did not bring back the dead. Talvex turned away from the window and walked back to his quarters. The diplomatic cruiser was old and tired, like everything else in the Confederacy. The lights flickered. The air recyclers hummed with a whirring rattle. The ship had been pulled from a reserve fleet that should have been scrapped years ago because there was nothing better available. On his desk, a secure data tablet waited for him. He sat down and read the orders again, even though he had already memorized them. You are hereby authorized to make first contact with the species designated as Terrans, commonly known as humans. You are to assess their military capabilities and willingness to enter the conflict on behalf of the Confederacy. This mission is classified at the highest level. If captured, you will be disavowed. Below the official text, someone had added a handwritten note. It was from High Chancellor Meridax herself. The note was short. I know this seems like madness, Talvex. It probably is, but we are out of options. He put the tablet down and stared at the ceiling. Humans. Of all the desperate ideas the Confederacy had produced in 63 years of war, this was by far the most desperate. Every species in the galaxy knew about the humans, at least in the abstract. They were one of the great cautionary tales of the Galactic Council. 2 centuries ago, a routine survey ship had discovered a small blue planet in the Orion Arm, home to a primitive species that had just barely begun reaching into space. The survey team had spent 3 months observing them from orbit, and what they found had deeply disturbed the Council. The humans were predators. Not in the way that some species were predators, with a distant evolutionary history of hunting that had long since been softened by civilization. The humans were active, enthusiastic predators. They hunted for sport. They fought each other constantly. Their entire history was an unbroken chain of wars, each more destructive than the last. They had split the atom and immediately used it to destroy 2 of their own cities. They had developed biological weapons, chemical weapons, weapons that could poison their own world for generations. And through all of it, they kept going. They kept building. They kept fighting. The Council had classified them as a Category 5 predator species. The quarantine had been established within a year. A boundary of monitoring satellites and automated warning buoys was placed around their little corner of the Orion Arm, and the galaxy agreed to leave them alone and hoped they destroyed themselves before they figured out how to leave their solar system. They did not destroy themselves. Instead, they thrived. They spread across their own system. They built stations and colonies on dead worlds and floating rocks. And then, roughly 50 years ago, a human research team had found a crashed alien probe on one of their outer moons. The probe was old. It had been drifting for centuries before it fell. Its technology was outdated by galactic standards, but the humans did not care about galactic standards. They took that broken ancient probe apart piece by piece, studied every component, and within a decade, they had built their own version of a faster-than-light drive. It was crude. It was inefficient. It was, by any reasonable measure, dangerous. But it worked. The humans crossed the quarantine boundary 12 years before Talvex was born. The Council detected them, filed a formal protest, and then did absolutely nothing about it. The war was already consuming all their attention, and a handful of human colony ships in the far reaches of the Orion Arm seemed like a problem for another century. Now Talvex was flying toward that problem at maximum speed, carrying the hopes of a dying civilization in his briefcase. The journey took 11 days. 11 days of jumping through forgotten hyperspace lanes, skirting the edges of the quarantine zone, and praying that neither the Velshara nor the Council detected him. His crew was small. 6 Iridians, all volunteers, all aware that they might not come home. They passed the time in nervous silence, checking and rechecking the ship's systems, reviewing what little intelligence the Confederacy had on human space. The intelligence was thin. Scattered reports from long-range sensor sweeps, a few intercepted human radio transmissions that the analysts had struggled to decode, blurry images of human ships that looked crude and ugly compared to the elegant vessels of the Confederacy. Everything suggested a young, small civilization that was barely holding itself together on the edge of explored space. On the morning of the 12th day, they arrived at the human frontier world of Nova Cascadia. Talvex had expected a primitive outpost, a few scattered settlements on a barely terraformed rock, maybe some orbital platforms and a handful of patrol ships. What he found made his blood run cold. Nova Cascadia was a fortress. The planet itself was green and blue, clearly well established, with city lights visible on the night side. But it was what surrounded the planet that stopped Talvex in his tracks. Orbital defense platforms. Dozens of them. Weapons arrays that his sensors could not fully identify. A shipyard complex that stretched across the sky like a metal spiderweb, with ships in various stages of construction filling every berth. And ships. Warships. Not the crude, ugly vessels from the intelligence reports. These were sleek and heavily armed, bristling with weapons that Talvex's sensors flagged as unknown. His communications officer looked up at him with wide eyes. "Sir, I am counting over 40 warships in orbit. And the shipyard. The construction rate. This does not match our intelligence at all." Talvex gripped the armrest of his chair. "How long have they been building?" "Based on the infrastructure I am seeing, at least 20 years. Maybe longer." 20 years. The humans had been preparing for war for 20 years. While the galaxy ignored them, while the Council renewed their quarantine and filed their reports, the humans had been quietly, patiently building a war machine. A transmission came through, a human voice and speaking in accented but clear galactic common. "Unidentified Iridian vessel, you have entered United Terran Defense Force controlled space. State your identity and purpose or you will be fired upon. You have 60 seconds. Talvex swallowed hard. "This is Diplomatic Envoy Talvex of the Iridian Confederacy. Well, I am here on a mission of peace. I request an audience with your commanding officer." There was a pause. Then the voice came back, slightly less hostile. "Hold your position, envoy. Do not move. Do not power weapons. Do not scan our installations. A security escort will be with you shortly." The escort arrived in 4 minutes. 3 human warships, each one nearly the size of Talvex's cruiser, took up positions around them with practiced precision. They were guided to a docking berth on one of the orbital platforms, and Talvex was escorted through a series of security checkpoints that made Iridian military protocols look casual by comparison. He noticed everything. The humans moved with a quiet efficiency that reminded him of predators. Their soldiers were tall and muscular, their eyes sharp and watchful. They carried weapons openly. And the corridors of the station were clean and functional, with none of the elegant decoration that Iridian stations favored. Everything here had a purpose. Everything here was built for war. They brought him to a conference room deep inside the station. It was plain and gray, with a single long table and hard chairs. A screen on one wall showed a live feed of the space outside. At the far end of the table sat a human woman. She was not what Talvex had expected. She was shorter than the soldiers who guarded the door. Her hair was dark, streaked with gray, and pulled back from a face that was lined with age and something harder. She wore a simple uniform with none of the medals or ribbons that Iridian admirals covered themselves in. But her eyes were what held Talvex in place. They were dark and calm, and absolutely without fear. Or they were the eyes of someone who had seen terrible things and made peace with them. "Envoy Talvex," she said. Her voice was low and steady. "I am Admiral Reina Castillo, commander of the United Terran Defense Force. Sit down." He sat. His diplomatic training kicked in. and he began the formal greeting protocols that the Confederacy used for first contact situations. Castillo listened politely for about 30 seconds, then held up a hand. I appreciate the formality, envoy, but let us skip to the point. Your Confederacy is losing the war. You have been losing for 2 decades. Your fleet strength is down to roughly 30% of its pre-war levels. The Velshara are advancing on 3 fronts, and your industrial capacity cannot replace losses fast enough to hold them. You are here because your government has run out of allies. You run out of options and decided that the quarantine predators on the edge of the galaxy are better than extinction. Talvik stared at her. You know all of this? Castillo's expression did not change. We have been watching your war since it started, envoy. We have been watching the galaxy since we were old enough to look up and realize we were not alone. We intercepted your council's quarantine reports. We read what they wrote about us. Dangerous, irrational, too aggressive to integrate. She paused. They were not entirely wrong. Talvex felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Then you know why I am here. You want our help? Yes. You want us to send our ships and our soldiers to die in a war that your civilization started and your civilization failed to finish. Talvex opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. She was right. There was no point in pretending otherwise. Yes, he said again. Castillo leaned back in her chair. For a long moment, she said nothing. She just looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. Talvex had spent his entire career reading people, understanding their motivations, predicting their responses. He could not read this woman at all. The galaxy locked us away, Castillo said finally. They found us, decided we were monsters, and put up a fence. They did not try to talk to us. They did not try to understand us. They looked at our history and saw only the violence. And they decided that was all we were. Admiral, I am not finished. Her voice did not rise, but something in it made Talvex's words die in his throat. For 200 years, we have lived behind that fence. We have watched your civilizations through our telescopes and your own transmissions. We watched you build wonders. We watched you make peace and break it. We watched you start this war, and we watched billions die. And do you know what we did, envoy? We prepared. Because we knew with absolute certainty that one day the galaxy would come to our door, either to kill us or to beg for our help, and we decided that when that day came, we would be ready for both. The room was very quiet. Talvex forced himself to speak. And which is it, Admiral? Will you help us or will you turn us away? Castillo stood. She walked to the screen on the wall and looked at the stars outside. When she turned back to face him, there was something new in her expression. Not anger, not pity, something older and more dangerous than either. We will help you, envoy, but understand something. We are not doing this for the Confederacy. We are not doing this for the Council that locked us away. We are doing this because 12 million humans live on colony worlds that will be in the path of the Velshara advance within 2 years. We are doing this because we have watched innocent people die for 63 years, and we are done watching. She placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. And we will do this on our terms, our command structure, our rules of engagement. Your admirals do not give orders to my captains. Your politicians do not set our strategy. You asked the predators for help, envoy. Now you will see what that means. Talvex nodded. He did not trust his voice. Castillo straightened up and pressed a button on the table. Captain, signal the home fleet. Tell them to begin mobilization protocol. Full activation. A voice came back through the speaker. Full activation, Admiral? That is everything. Everything, Castillo confirmed. It is time. She looked at Talvex one last time. There was the faintest shadow of a smile on her face, and it was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. We have been watching your war for a long time, envoy. We were wondering when someone would finally ask. Talvex sat alone in the conference room for a long time after she left. Through the window, he could see the shipyard coming alive. Lights were turning on across its massive frame. Ships were moving. The station beneath him vibrated with a low, deep hum that he could feel in his bones. He thought about what he had done. He thought about the reports he had read about humans, their wars, their weapons, their relentless, unstoppable drive to survive and fight and win at any cost. He had come here to save the Confederacy. Now, sitting in the heart of a human war machine that was waking up around him like a sleeping giant opening its eyes, he was not sure if he had saved anyone at all. He was not sure the galaxy was ready for what was coming, But it was too late to turn back now. The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. It started as a rumor, whispers in the trade stations and diplomatic halls. Someone had broken the quarantine. Someone had made contact with the humans. Within hours, the whispers became headlines. Within days, every species in the galaxy was talking about it. The Iridian Confederacy had asked the humans for help, and the humans had said yes. On the Velshara homeworld, in the Grand War Chamber that overlooked the capital city like a crown of black stone, Supreme Commander Zhel Khan received the report with something between amusement and contempt. He was a tall creature, even by Velshara standards, with deep crimson skin and 4 eyes that glowed like heated metal. He had commanded the Dominion's war effort for 31 years. He had broken the Iridian fleet at Tessara. He had burned 17 of their worlds. He had turned the tide of the war through sheer, ruthless brilliance, and he had never once doubted that total victory was only a matter of time. He read the intelligence report twice, then tossed the data tablet onto the table. "Humans," he said. His adjutant, a nervous young officer named Kelthar, stood at attention. "Yes, Supreme Commander. Our intelligence confirms that the Iridians have formed a formal military alliance with the Terran species." "The quarantine species?" "Yes, sir." Zhel Khan let out a sound that the Velshara used for bitter laughter. "The Iridians must be truly desperate. They have gone begging to animals." He stood and walked to the massive window that formed the entire far wall of the chamber. Below him, the capital city stretched to the horizon, a monument to Velshara power. Warships moved through the sky in perfect formation. If factories churned out weapons and armor around the clock. The Dominion was a machine, built for one purpose, and it had never failed. "What do we know about their military strength?" he asked. Kelthar pulled up the data. "Limited, sir. Our long-range scans suggest a fleet of approximately 200 warships. Their technology is several generations behind ours. Their FTL capability is crude. They have a small number of colony worlds with modest populations. Total estimated military personnel is somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million. Zhel Khan did not even turn around. "We have 14 million soldiers under arms and 3,000 warships. The Iridians have gone mad." "Should we adjust our strategy, sir?" "No. Continue the advance on all fronts. If the humans are foolish enough to put themselves in our path, we will crush them along with the Iridians. This changes nothing." He dismissed Kelthar with a wave of his hand and returned to studying the war maps. The humans were insects with delusions. They would learn. Across the galaxy, in the Iridian capital, the mood was only slightly more optimistic. Talvex had returned with the human delegation, and the Iridian High Command had gathered to meet their new allies. The meeting did not go well. The human delegation was led by a man named General Marcus Webb, a broad-shouldered figure with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone. He spoke Galactic Common with a heavy accent and showed no interest at all in the formal pleasantries that Iridian culture demanded. He shook hands too hard. He spoke too directly. When the Iridian Fleet Marshal began a lengthy speech about the history of the Confederacy and the honor of their alliance, Webb waited politely for about 2 minutes, then interrupted. "Marshal, I appreciate the welcome, but my people are going to be dying in your war very soon, so I would like to skip the ceremony and talk about what we are actually dealing with." The Fleet Marshal's face turned a shade of purple that Talvex recognized as deep offense, but the Marshal swallowed his pride because he had no choice. The Confederacy needed these humans, rude as they were. The military briefing was sobering. The Iridians laid out their current position, and it was worse than Talvex had feared. The Velshara controlled 60% of the contested territories. The Iridian fleet had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength, and 3 more worlds were expected to fall within the next 2 months. At the current rate of attrition, the Confederacy would collapse within 3 years. Webb studied the maps and the data in silence. Then he asked a single question that stunned everyone in the room. "Where are your reserves?" The Fleet Marshal blinked. "Our reserves? Your reserve forces, your backup fleet, your emergency production capacity, the forces you have been holding back for a situation exactly like this one." "General, we have no reserves. Everything we have is deployed. Every ship, every soldier. We have been fighting at full capacity for over a decade." Webb stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he turned to his aide and said something in the human language. Talvex did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was the tone of a man who had just realized the situation was far worse than he had been told. "All right," Webb said finally. "We will work with what you have. But I need you to understand something, Marshall. The way you have been fighting this war is the reason you are losing. That is going to change." The Iridians did not like hearing this, but they listened. They had no choice. While the diplomats and generals argued in the capital, something far more significant was happening across human space. Something that no species in the galaxy had ever witnessed before, because no species in the galaxy had ever done anything like it. Humanity was mobilizing, not just their military, not just their fleet, everything. Every factory, every shipyard, every laboratory, every school, every person. The entire species was shifting, collectively and voluntarily, onto a war footing. Commander Sylphie of the Iridian Navy was the first alien to witness it firsthand. She had been assigned as a military observer to the human forces, a role she had accepted with a mixture of curiosity and dread. The Iridian High Command wanted someone embedded with the humans to assess their real capabilities and report back. They chose Sylphie because she was smart, calm, and had a reputation for being unshakable. Within a week, she was shaken. Her first stop was the Terran colony of Ethan Prime, a mid-sized industrial world that had been designated as a primary production hub. When she arrived, the planet was already in the middle of its transformation. Civilian car factories were being retooled to produce armored vehicle components. A company that had made kitchen appliances 2 weeks ago was now manufacturing missile guidance systems. A university research lab had been converted into a weapons development center, and the students who had been studying theoretical physics were now building prototype energy weapons with a speed that terrified her. She asked her human liaison, a young officer named Lieutenant Sarah Chen, how this was possible. How could a civilization shift its entire industrial base so quickly? Chen looked at her with an expression that Sylphie could not quite read. "We have been planning for this for a long time, Commander. Every factory on every Terran world has a war conversion protocol. Every engineer has dual training. We hoped we would never need it, but we always knew we probably would." "You planned for this? Or for a war that had nothing to do with you?" Chen shrugged. A very human gesture that Sylphie was beginning to understand meant something between acceptance and defiance. "We plan for everything. We are humans. It is what we do." Sylphie spent the next 3 weeks traveling through human space, and every day brought new revelations that she documented in increasingly urgent reports to High Command. She visited a shipyard on the colony world of New Vladivostok, where she watched a warship being built from the keel up in real time. The shipyard operated around the clock. 3 shifts of workers, each one picking up exactly where the last one left off, with a precision and speed that Iridian shipwrights would have called impossible. She asked the yard foreman how long it would take to complete the ship. He said 6 weeks. An equivalent Iridian vessel took 8 months. She watched human engineers solve problems in ways that no galactic species would have attempted. When a critical shortage of a specific alloy threatened to delay production, a materials scientist on Ethan Prime invented a substitute compound in 48 hours. It was not as good as the original. It was, by galactic standards, crude. But it worked. The humans did not care about elegance. They cared about results. She observed human soldiers in training and found herself unable to look away. They trained with an intensity that bordered on self-destruction. They ran until they collapsed, then got up and ran again. They fought each other in hand-to-hand combat with a controlled ferocity that made her stomach turn. And between the training sessions, they laughed, they told jokes. Or they played music and sang songs and argued about trivial things like sports and food. The contrast between their warmth as people and their brutality as warriors was something Sylphie could not reconcile. One night she sat in the mess hall of a training base on Nova Cascadia and watched a group of human soldiers eating dinner. They were young. Some of them looked barely old enough to be adults. They were loud and cheerful, throwing food at each other and laughing at stories she could not follow. One of them had a small animal on his shoulder, a furry creature with big eyes that the humans called a cat. The soldier fed it scraps from his plate and spoke to it in a soft, gentle voice. These were the same soldiers she had watched that morning beat each other bloody in a fighting pit and then help each other up afterward with smiles on their faces. She did not understand them. She was beginning to think that no one ever would. In her reports to High Command, Sylphie tried to be objective. She listed numbers, ship production rates, troop strength, weapons capabilities. She compared human technology to Velshara and Iridian equivalents, and noted that the humans were behind in most areas, but closing the gap with alarming speed. She documented their organizational structure, their command hierarchy, their logistics networks, but the numbers did not capture what she was really seeing. And the numbers did not capture the look in a human engineer's eyes when she worked for 36 straight hours to solve a shield harmonics problem, running on nothing but caffeine and stubbornness. The numbers did not capture the way an entire planet could shift from peacetime to wartime in a matter of weeks. Not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. The numbers did not capture the sheer, terrifying willpower of a species that had been locked behind a quarantine fence for 2 centuries and had spent that time not sulking, not stagnating, but preparing. She read their history. She read about their world wars, their revolutions, their disasters. She read about cities that were bombed to rubble and rebuilt within a generation. She read about diseases that killed millions and were conquered by scientists working day and night. She read about a species that had been knocked down 1,000 times and had gotten up 1,001. And she read about their wars, not just the facts and dates, but the stories. The soldiers who threw themselves on explosives to save their friends. The medics who ran into fire to drag wounded comrades to safety. The pilots who flew burning aircraft into enemy ships because they refused to die without taking something with them. The civilians who sheltered strangers at the cost of their own lives. Sylphie had seen bravery in Iridian soldiers. She had seen courage and sacrifice. But she had never seen anything like this. The humans did not just fight to win, they fought to protect. They fought for each other with a desperate, burning love that was, in its own way, more frightening than any weapon. She sent her reports. She was careful. She was thorough. She was honest. The final line of her last classified report to the Iridian High Command read, "We did not invite allies into this war. We have unleashed something." She was right, but even she did not yet understand how right she was. Across human space, the mobilization continued. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Scientists shared research openly, breaking down the barriers of competition and secrecy that normally slowed progress. Musicians wrote songs about the war. Artists painted murals on the sides of factory buildings. Children sent letters to soldiers they had never met. The entire species was moving together, like a single organism waking up from a long sleep. On Earth, in a quiet room in the old city of Geneva, Admiral Castillo stood before the United Terran Congress and asked for a formal declaration of war against the Velshara Dominion. The vote was unanimous. Every representative from every nation and every colony world voted yes. There were no debates, no arguments, no dissent. When it was done, Castillo walked to the window and looked up at the night sky. Somewhere out there, the Velshara were advancing, burning worlds, killing billions, and laughing at the thought that a quarantined species of primitives might slow them down. She allowed herself a small, cold smile. 2 weeks later, the first Terran battle fleet departed from Nova Cascadia. It was not a large fleet by galactic standards. 47 warships, each one freshly built and bristling with weapons that the galaxy had never seen. They were crewed by men and women who had volunteered to fly into a war on the other side of the galaxy, knowing many of them would not come home. As the fleet passed the outer marker of human space, the shipyard workers on the orbital platforms stopped their work and watched. They did not cheer. They did not wave flags. They simply stood in silence and watched their ships disappear into the darkness of faster-than-light travel. Then they went back to work. There were more ships to build. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Castillo sat in her command chair and studied the star charts that showed the front lines of the war. Her officers moved around her in quiet efficiency, running final checks and confirming jump coordinates. Her first officer, Captain David Park, approached her chair. "Admiral, we are ready to jump to the Iridian staging area. Fleet reports all ships nominal." "Good," Park hesitated. "Admiral, I have been reviewing the Velshara force projections. Their numbers are significant." Castillo did not look up from the star charts. "I know. We are 47 ships, ma'am. They have 3,000. "I know that too, Captain." Park waited. When nothing more came, he asked the question that everyone on the bridge was thinking. "How do we win this?" Castillo finally looked up. She looked at Park, then at the officers around the bridge. Every one of them was looking back at her. Young faces, brave faces, faces that trusted her to lead them into the fire and bring as many of them back as possible. "We win this the way we have always won," she said. "We adapt. We improvise. We refuse to die. Wow, and we make them regret every moment they spent thinking we were not a threat." She turned back to the star charts. "Take us to war, Captain." The fleet jumped. The stars stretched and blurred and vanished, and 47 human warships hurtled through the void toward a war that had been waiting for them for 63 years. Behind them, on 12 colony worlds and one small blue planet called Earth, the factories kept running. The shipyards kept building. The volunteers kept coming. The galaxy had forgotten about them. The galaxy had locked them away and moved on. But the humans had not forgotten. They had watched. They had waited. They had prepared. And now finally they were coming. The Cathera system had been dead for 11 years. Once it had been a thriving Iridian trade hub. The 3 habitable moons orbiting a massive gas giant, connected by a web of space stations and shipping lanes that carried goods from one end of the Confederacy to the other. 200 million Iridians had lived there. They had built gardens on the moons and glass cities that caught the light of the distant sun and sparkled like jewels against the darkness of space. The Velshara had taken Cathara in a single week. The gardens were ash now. The glass cities were shattered. The Iridians who had not escaped in time were dead or enslaved. What remained was a graveyard of broken ships and a Velshara garrison of 47 warships that controlled the hyperspace lane connecting the Iridian core worlds to their outer colonies. Taking back Cathara had been deemed impossible by the Iridian High Command. The garrison was too strong, the defenses too well established. They had written it off as lost territory and focused their remaining forces on holding the inner systems. Admiral Castillo did not care what the Iridian High Command deemed impossible. The Terran battle fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Cathara system at exactly 0400 hours, Terran Standard Time. 47 ships. The Velshara garrison outnumbered them 3-1. The Iridian military advisors embedded with the fleet had recommended a cautious approach. Observation first, intelligence gathering, maybe a series of probing attacks to test the garrison's defenses. Castillo listened to their recommendations politely. Then she ignored them. "All ships, battle formation Alpha 7, she said. Her voice was calm and steady over the fleet communications channel. "Yes, we are going in fast and hard. Weapons free in 3 minutes. Do not wait for my order to engage. If it is Velshara, kill it." Commander Sylphie, who had been assigned to observe the battle from the bridge of the flagship, felt her stomach drop. "Admiral, should we not conduct reconnaissance first? We do not know the full disposition of their forces." Castillo glanced at her. "Commander, I appreciate your input, but we are not here to study them. We are here to kill them." She turned back to the tactical display. "All ships, execute." The Terran fleet surged forward. On the other side of the system, Velshara Fleet Captain Dravan was in his quarters when the alarm sounded. He had been stationed at Cathara for 2 years, and in that time nothing had happened. The system was a backwater garrison posting, far from the front lines. The most exciting thing that had occurred in the last 6 months was a minor malfunction in the station's water recycling system. He reached the bridge of his cruiser in 4 minutes. His officers were already at their stations, and the tactical display was showing a cluster of unknown contacts approaching at high speed. "Report," he ordered. 47 contacts, Captain, approaching from the system's outer boundary. Speed is... Sir, their speed is extremely high, much higher than standard combat approach velocity. Identification? Unknown configuration, sir. No match in our database." The officer paused. "Sir, their communications are broadcasting on an open channel. The language does not match any known Iridian dialect." Dravan frowned. "Put it on speaker." The bridge filled with sound. It was music, loud, aggressive, a pounding music with screaming vocals and instruments that Dravan could not identify. It was the most unpleasant thing he had ever heard. It was also, he realized with a chill, a deliberate provocation. Whoever these beings were, they were announcing their presence with all the subtlety of a bomb. "Sir," his tactical officer said, "I believe these are the humans." Dravan had read the intelligence briefings about the human alliance with the Confederacy. Like most Velshara officers, he had dismissed it as irrelevant. The humans were primitives. Their ships were crude. Their fleet was tiny. They were a curiosity, not a threat. "Raise shields and power weapons," he said. "Signal the garrison to form standard defensive formation. We outnumber them 3-1. This will be over quickly." It was over quickly. But not in the way Dravan expected. The humans did not fight like anything the Velshara had ever encountered. They did not fight like anything anyone in the galaxy had ever encountered. Galactic warfare had rules. Not written rules, but patterns that had been established over thousands of years of interstellar conflict. Fleets formed into orderly formations. They approached each other at measured speeds. They exchanged fire at established ranges. When one side gained an advantage, the other retreated in good order, regrouped, and tried again. It was civilized. It was predictable. It was rational. The humans were not rational. The Terran fleet hit the Velshara garrison like a hammer. They did not form orderly lines. They came in from multiple angles at different speeds, some in a formation that looked like chaos, but moved with a terrible, fluid coordination. Small groups of ships attacked different sections of the garrison simultaneously, forcing the Velshara to split their fire and their attention. Dravan's first instinct was to concentrate his forces and meet the attack head-on. It was standard doctrine. It was what any Velshara commander would do. He ordered his fleet to tighten formation and focus fire on the largest group of human ships. The humans responded by not being where his guns were pointing. They were fast. Faster than their ship specifications suggested they should be. They dodged and weaved through the wreckage of the old Iridian stations, using debris as cover in a way that no galactic fleet had ever attempted. Dravan's gunners were trained to hit targets in open space, moving in predictable patterns. The humans did not move in predictable patterns. They moved like predators, darting and feinting and striking from unexpected angles. Then the boarding pods hit. Dravan did not even know what they were at first. Small, fast projectiles launched from the human ships at velocities that his point defense systems could barely track. They slammed into the hulls of 3 Velshara cruisers and punched through the armor like needles through cloth. Inside each pod were human soldiers in heavy combat armor, and they poured into the ships with a ferocity that turned the corridors into slaughterhouses. The Velshara were bigger than humans. They were stronger. They had thicker skin and faster reflexes. In a fair fight, a Velshara warrior should have been able to defeat a human easily. Yes, the humans did not fight fair. They used explosives in enclosed spaces. They hacked door controls and vented compartments to vacuum. They fought in groups, covering each other with practiced precision, and they kept coming even when they were wounded. One human soldier, according to the few surviving Velshara crew members, continued fighting with a metal shard embedded in his leg, using a dead Velshara's weapon because his own had run out of ammunition. He killed 4 more Velshara before a medic dragged him to safety. While the boarding actions threw the garrison into confusion, the rest of the Terran fleet pressed its advantage. Human electronic warfare systems scrambled Velshara communications, flooding their frequencies with noise and that same terrible music. Coordination between Velshara ships broke down. Captains could not reach the garrison commander. Ships began acting independently, making mistakes, getting in each other's way. Dravan watched the battle deteriorate with growing horror. He had been a military officer for 20 years. He had fought in a dozen engagements against the Iridians. He had never felt fear in combat. The Velshara trained their officers to be calm, logical, and detached. Fear was weakness. Fear was failure. But this was different. This was not the measured professional combat he was trained for. This was violence in its rawest form, applied with intelligence and creativity and an absolute refusal to play by the rules. The humans were not just fighting. They were dismantling his garrison piece by piece, exploiting every weakness, punishing every mistake, and moving faster than his command structure could respond. 6 hours into the battle, Dravan's flagship took a direct hit from a weapon he had never seen before. It was some kind of jury-rigged electromagnetic pulse device, crudely built but devastatingly effective. It knocked out his ship's shields and half its systems in a single blast. Before his engineers could restore power, 3 human ships converged on his position and opened fire. His cruiser broke apart in 12 seconds. Dravan made it to an escape pod. As the pod tumbled through the debris field, he looked out through the tiny viewport and saw the Cathara system burning. Velshara ships were everywhere, broken and drifting and dying. Human ships moved through the wreckage like sharks, finishing off the wounded, collecting escape pods, and systematically destroying every piece of military hardware the garrison had left. The Battle of Cathara lasted 9 hours from start to finish. Of the 47 Velshara warships in the garrison, 43 were destroyed. The remaining 4 surrendered. The humans lost 6 ships. 6. The shockwave hit the galaxy within hours. On the Velshara homeworld, Supreme Commander Khan received the battle report in silence. He read it 3 times. He read the tactical analysis, the casualty figures, the sensor recordings that showed human ships doing things that his own admiral said were impossible. He read the intercepted communications from the surviving Velshara crews, and he noticed something that disturbed him more than the defeat itself. His soldiers were afraid, not cautious, not concerned, afraid. The Velshara language had very few words for fear. It was not an emotion their culture valued or even fully understood, but the reports from Cathara were full of it. Descriptions of human soldiers that kept fighting after being wounded, ships that rammed into Velshara vessels rather than retreat, weapons that appeared out of nowhere, improvised on the battlefield, designed to exploit specific weaknesses that the humans should not have known about. One phrase appeared in multiple reports used by different crews who had no contact with each other, the same words independently chosen to describe what they had encountered. The predators are here. Khan stood and walked to his war map. He stood there for a long time, looking at the markers that represented his fleets, his territory, his strength. Then he began issuing new orders. Fleet reserves from 3 sectors were to be redeployed to the human axis of advance. Intelligence assets were to be redirected to study human capabilities. Research teams were to analyze the weapons used at Cathara and develop countermeasures. He did not tell anyone why. He did not explain his sudden shift in priorities. But his adjutant Kelthar noticed that for the first time in 31 years of command, Khan had stopped smiling. In the Iridian capital, the news of Cathara was received with stunned disbelief. The Iridian High Command had expected the humans to lose, or at best to fight to a draw. A complete victory against a garrison that outnumbered them 3-1 was not something they had even considered as a possibility. Talvex watched the reaction from his office in the diplomatic quarter. He saw the mixture of relief and fear on the faces of the Iridian leadership, and he understood both emotions perfectly. Relief because the humans were as powerful as he had hoped. Fear because the humans were more powerful than anyone had imagined. The neutral species across the galaxy reacted with open panic. The Catharan battle recordings leaked within days, as they always did, and suddenly every government, every military, every intelligence agency in the galaxy was watching humans fight for the first time. They did not like what they saw. The Galactic Council held an emergency session. Ambassadors from a dozen species demanded answers. Who had authorized the humans to leave quarantine? Who had given them weapons? How had they built a fleet without anyone noticing? The Iridian delegation sat in uncomfortable silence, while species that had spent 63 years doing nothing about the war suddenly found their voices to complain about the one civilization that was actually doing something. But behind the diplomatic outrage, something deeper was happening. The galaxy was reassessing humanity. For 2 centuries, the humans had been an abstract concept, a quarantine species, a cautionary tale, a line item in council reports. Now they were real. Now they were in the war. And the galaxy was beginning to understand something that Sylphie had already written in her classified reports. The humans were not just another military force. They were something different, something the galaxy had not seen in thousands of years. A species that fought not with doctrine and tradition and established methods, but with creativity and adaptability and a kind of controlled madness that turned every assumption upside down. And they were just getting started. On the bridge of her flagship, which had taken moderate damage but was already being repaired by crews who had started working before the last Velshara ship had even stopped firing, Admiral Castillo reviewed the casualty reports. 6 ships lost, 211 dead. She read every name. She always read every name. Captain Park approached her. "Admiral, we are receiving a priority transmission from Terran Command. The first production wave is complete." "How many?" 312 new warships, ma'am. They will reach the front in 6 weeks. Castillo nodded. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She looked at the star chart showing the Velshara positions and began planning the next attack. Sylphie stood in a corner of the bridge and watched her. She had watched the battle from this same bridge, gripping a support rail with both hands as the ship shook and screamed around her. She had watched human officers bark orders and make split-second decisions that changed the course of the fight. She had watched them cheer when enemies fell and go silent when friends died. Now she watched them mourn. The bridge crew had set up a small memorial in the corner, a piece of metal from one of the destroyed ships, with names scratched into it. As officers passed by, they would touch it briefly and move on. No ceremony, no speeches. Just a quiet acknowledgement that people they loved were gone. Then they went back to work. Sylvie thought about her reports. She thought about the words she had used to describe humanity. Aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous. All true. But she was beginning to understand that those words did not tell the whole story. These creatures did not fight because they enjoyed destruction. They fought because they could not bear to lose the people beside them. Every reckless charge, every suicidal boarding action, every impossible improvisation she had witnessed at Cathara was driven not by bloodlust, but by something far more powerful. They loved. They loved each other with a fierce, burning intensity that drove them to do impossible things. And when they lost someone they loved, they did not retreat. They got angry. Sylvie looked at the memorial in the corner, at the names scratched into metal, and she felt something she had never felt before in 20 years of military service. She was glad they were on her side, because she was beginning to understand what would happen if they were not. 6 months after the Battle of Cathara, the galaxy no longer laughed at humanity. The war had changed. Everyone could feel it. The slow, grinding stalemate that had defined the conflict for decades was gone, replaced by something faster and more violent and more terrifying than anything the galaxy had seen in living memory. The humans had not just entered the war, they had set it on fire. The Terran fleet had grown to over 1,000 warships. 1,000. The number staggered the Iridians, who had spent 3 years building their last batch of 200 ships. The humans had done it in 6 months. Their shipyards ran day and night, staffed by workers who rotated in shifts and seemed to never stop. New designs rolled off the production lines before the old ones had even finished testing. The humans did not wait for perfection. They built, they tested in combat, they learned, they built again. Each new generation of ships was better than the last, and the generations came faster than anyone thought possible. Their tactics had evolved too. The desperate improvisation of Cathara had been refined into something the Iridian military analysts called controlled chaos. It was a doctrine unlike anything in the galactic playbook. Multi-vector assaults from unexpected angles, deep strikes behind enemy lines, psychological warfare that attacked the minds of Velshara commanders before a single shot was fired. And always, in the relentless forward momentum that was the hallmark of human warfare. Where the Iridians would take a system and stop to consolidate, the humans were already moving to the next target. Where the Velshara would retreat and regroup, the humans followed, pressing the advantage, never giving them time to breathe. The results spoke for themselves. In 6 months, the combined Terran Iridian forces had recaptured 37 systems. The Velshara front line, which had been steadily advancing for 20 years, was now in full retreat. For the first time in the history of the war, it was the Dominion that was losing ground. Supreme Commander Zhel Khan stood in his war chamber and stared at the map that told the story of his failure. Red markers showed the Velshara positions pulling back. Blue markers showed the advancing enemy forces. And among the blue markers, a new color had appeared. White. The color his intelligence officers had assigned to the human fleet. 6 months ago, the white markers had been a tiny cluster on the edge of the map. Now they were everywhere, pushing deeper into Dominion territory with every passing week. He had tried everything. He had reinforced the front lines with his best units. He had deployed new weapon systems. He had reorganized his command structure and replaced the officers who had failed against the humans. Nothing worked. The humans adapted too quickly. They learned from every engagement. They turned every Velshara tactic against itself, finding weaknesses that his own strategists had never considered. Worse than the military defeats was what the humans were doing to his soldiers. The Velshara were a proud species, and bred and trained for war. They had fought the Iridians for 6 decades without flinching. But the humans were different. The humans did not fight like civilized beings. They fought like animals. They appeared out of nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished before the Velshara could respond. They broadcast messages into Velshara space, messages in broken Velshara language that mocked their commanders and promised more destruction. Human special forces landed on occupied worlds in the dead of night. Armed resistance fighters destroyed supply depots and disappeared like ghosts. For the first time in the war, Velshara soldiers were reporting something that their commanders struggled to understand. They were afraid. Not the rational caution of a professional military, facing a strong opponent. Something deeper, something older. The ancient primal dread of a prey animal that knows it is being hunted. The feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The certainty that something terrible was lurking just beyond the edge of perception, waiting to strike. The Velshara did not have a strong cultural concept of fear. Their language had few words for it, but their bodies knew. Their sleep cycles were disrupted. Their reaction times were slowing. Their morale was crumbling. Entire units were losing effectiveness, not because of casualties, but because of the constant, grinding pressure of fighting an enemy that never stopped, never rested, and never showed mercy to those who resisted. Jel Khan watched his empire crack, and for the first time in his life, he felt the cold hand of desperation close around his heart. He needed to change the calculus of the war. He needed to do something so devastating, so terrible, that it would break the humans the way they had broken his soldiers. He ordered the bombardment of Elysium. Elysium was a human colony world on the outer edge of Terran space. It was not a military target. It had no warships, no weapons factories, no strategic value. It was a peaceful world of farms and small cities, home to 12 million human civilians, families, children, people who had never held a weapon in their lives. Jel Khan's own admirals protested. Orbital bombardment of a civilian world was not unprecedented in the war, but it was considered an extreme measure, used only against targets of strategic importance. Elysium had no strategic importance. The bombardment would serve no military purpose. It was pure punishment, pure terror, designed to send a message. Jel Khan overruled every objection. The humans fight because they believe they are invincible, he told his war council. We will show them that they are not. We will show them that their worlds can burn just as easily as the Iridians' worlds burned. We will break their spirit. The bombardment fleet arrived at Elysium on a Tuesday morning. There were no warships to defend the planet. The few orbital platforms were civilian models, communications relays, and weather satellites that had never been designed to withstand military fire. The Velshara fleet brushed them aside like cobwebs and took up bombardment positions in high orbit. The people of Elysium had 37 minutes of warning. 37 minutes between the first detection of the Velshara fleet and the first kinetic rounds hitting the surface. 37 minutes to run, to hide, to hold their children and pray. It was not enough. The bombardment lasted 4 hours. The Velshara used kinetic impactors, massive rods of dense metal dropped from orbit at tremendous velocity. Each one hit the surface with the force of a nuclear weapon. Cities were flattened in seconds. The impacts threw dust and debris into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun. Firestorms swept across the surface. The oceans boiled along the coastlines. The ground itself cracked and buckled under the sustained assault. When it was over, Elysium was silent. Of the 12 million people who had lived there, fewer than 800,000 survived. Those who had made it to the deep underground shelters that every human colony maintained for exactly this kind of nightmare. They huddled in the darkness, and I listening to the planet die above them, and they waited. The news reached the rest of humanity within hours. It spread through the colonies and across the communication networks like a wave of black ice, freezing everything it touched. On every human world, people stopped what they were doing and stared at their screens. They watched the footage from Elysium's orbital cameras. They saw the cities disappear. They saw the dust clouds spread across the planet like a funeral shroud. They saw the estimated casualty figures climb from thousands to millions, to a number that was too large and too terrible to comprehend. For a single terrifying moment, humanity was silent. Jel Khan waited for the reaction he had expected: grief, horror, shock, paralysis. He had studied the Iridians after he had bombed their worlds, and the pattern was always the same. The initial shock would freeze their decision-making for weeks. Their morale would collapse. Their will to fight would crack. He was wrong. The silence lasted exactly 1 day. 1 day of grief and shock and horror and tears, and the sound of a species mourning its dead. 1 day. Then the silence ended, and what replaced it was something that Jel Khan had not anticipated. Something that no one in the galaxy had ever witnessed. Something that would haunt the Velshara for the rest of their history. Humanity got angry. It was not the hot, explosive anger that burns bright and fades quickly. It was cold. It was deep. It was the anger of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars and the edge of nuclear extinction. It was the anger of a people who had buried 11 million of their own and decided with absolute calm and absolute certainty that the ones responsible would pay. On Earth, recruitment centers that had been processing thousands of volunteers per day were suddenly processing tens of thousands. Factories that were already running at maximum capacity found new reserves of energy and began producing at rates that their own engineers had said were impossible. Research programs that had been progressing steadily suddenly leaped forward, driven by scientists who had stopped sleeping and started working with a focused fury that bordered on madness. The phrase spread across human space like wildfire. It was spray-painted on the sides of warships. It was scratched into soldiers' armor. It was whispered by factory workers and shouted by crowds and printed on banners that hung from the walls of every military installation in the Terran colonies. Remember Elysium. On the Iridian flagship where Sylphie was stationed, the human officers changed overnight. They had always been intense, always driven, but there had been a warmth to them, a humor, a lightness that existed alongside their ferocity. After Elysium, the warmth did not disappear, but something harder settled over it, like steel being forged in fire. They still joked, they still laughed, but their eyes were different. There was something in their eyes that made Sylphie's blood run cold. She had seen predators before. She had studied the great hunting species of a dozen worlds. She knew what it looked like when a predator locked onto its prey. Every human she saw had that look now. Admiral Castillo addressed the Terran Congress 3 days after Elysium. Her speech was broadcast across the galaxy on every open channel. She did not restrict it. She wanted everyone to hear. She stood at the podium in her uniform, her face calm, her voice steady. She did not shout. She did not cry. She spoke with the quiet, controlled precision of a surgeon describing where she intended to cut. 3 days ago, the Velshara Dominion murdered 11,200,000 of our people. Men, women, children. They were not soldiers. They were not combatants. They were farmers and teachers and doctors and children who had never hurt anyone. She paused. The silence was absolute. The Velshara did this to break us. They believed that if they killed enough of our civilians, we would lose our will to fight. They believed that we were like the other species they have conquered, that we could be terrorized into submission. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in it had shifted. Something that made the translators on 1,000 alien worlds struggle to find the right word. They were wrong. She looked directly into the camera. I have a message for Supreme Commander Zelkan. You chose to make this personal. You will regret that. Every ship you have will burn. Every fortress you have built will fall. Every world you hold will be taken from you. And when we stand in the ashes of your capital, you will understand the mistake you made when you decided to murder our children. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. We are coming for you, Wada, and we will not stop. The speech lasted 4 minutes. Its effect lasted forever. Across the galaxy, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The Velshara propaganda machine tried to spin the bombardment of Elysium as a legitimate military action. No one believed them. Even species that had been neutral or sympathetic to the Dominion recoiled in disgust. Several neutral governments quietly expelled Velshara diplomatic missions. Trade agreements were frozen. Intelligence sharing arrangements were terminated. But the neutrals were not just angry at the Velshara. They were afraid of what was coming next. They had watched the humans fight for 6 months. They had seen what humans could do when they were motivated by strategy and alliance. Now the humans were motivated by something far more powerful. Revenge, grief, the cold, implacable rage of a species that had tried to coexist peacefully and been answered with genocide. The Galactic Council held emergency sessions that stretched for weeks. The debates were frantic and divided. Some ambassadors called for intervention, for a ceasefire, for anything that would stop the escalation. Others argued that the humans had every right to retaliate and that the Council had no standing to interfere, given that they had done nothing to stop the war for 63 years. A few, the oldest and wisest, said very little. They simply watched the human fleet movements on the strategic displays and calculated how long it would be before the Dominion fell. An ancient species called the Etheri, who had been so old and so reclusive that most younger civilizations considered them mythical, broke their silence for the first time in 1,000 years. Their message was broadcast to every government in the galaxy. It was a single sentence. delivered in a language so old that it had to be translated through 3 intermediate tongues before it could be understood. The sleeping predator has opened its eyes. Pray it remembers mercy. No one knew what to make of it. The Aetheri offered no further explanation. They retreated back into their silence and their ancient world, and the galaxy was left to interpret their warning alone. In the war chamber of the Velshara homeworld, Jelkan read the intelligence reports and felt something he had never felt before. His hands were shaking. The human fleet had swelled to over 1,500 warships. Their production rates were accelerating, not slowing. The reserves he had redeployed were being chewed up and spat out by human forces that fought with a fury that his analysts described as unprecedented. The front line was not just retreating now, it was collapsing. He had wanted to break them. Instead, he had done the one thing that every predator species in the history of the galaxy knew you should never do. He had given them a reason to hunt. Kelthar entered the war chamber with the latest battle reports. His face was gray. "Sir, we have lost the Vithara sector, all 12 systems. The humans advanced through it in 9 days." Jelkan did not respond. "Sir, the home fleet is requesting additional reinforcements. They are reporting human scout ships in the outer systems. The humans are probing our home defenses." Still nothing. "Sir, Kelthar hesitated. "Supreme Commander, what are your orders?" Jelkan looked at the map. The white markers were everywhere now, closing in from every direction, moving with a speed and coordination that should have been impossible for a species that had entered the war less than a year ago. He had spent 31 years building the Velshara war machine. He had conquered dozens of worlds. He had broken the Iridian Confederacy. He had been the most feared military commander in the galaxy. Now he was being hunted by a species that had been locked in a cage for 200 years, and the cage door was wide open. And the thing that had come out of it was angrier and more dangerous than anything he had ever imagined. He looked at Kelthar, and for the first time his adjutant saw something in his commander's eyes that he had never seen before. When that no Velshara had ever seen in those eyes. Fear. "Reinforce the homeworld," Jelkan said quietly. "Pull everything back. Every ship, every soldier. We defend the capital. Nothing else matters." It was the order of a desperate man. The order of a man who had finally realized that he was not the hunter. He was the prey. Far across the galaxy, the Terran Armada was forming. 1,500 warships, the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled, gathered at a staging point in liberated Iridian space. They were joined by what remained of the Iridian fleet, another 300 ships that looked small and tired next to the gleaming new Terran vessels. On the bridge of her flagship, Admiral Castillo reviewed the final attack plans. The target was the Velshara homeworld, the heart of the Dominion. Dummer, the seat of the Empire that had burned Elysium and laughed about it. Captain Park stood beside her. He looked at the fleet displayed on the tactical screen. 1,800 warships, millions of soldiers, the combined fury of 2 civilizations aimed at a single point. "No negotiation offered?" he asked quietly. Castillo looked at him. Her face was calm. Her eyes were not. "No," she said, "not yet." The fleet jumped. The stars blurred and vanished, and the largest armada in galactic history hurtled through the void toward the Velshara homeworld. In its wake, the galaxy held its breath and wondered what would be left when the humans were done. And in the halls of the ancient Aetheri, where beings older than most civilizations sat in their eternal silence, one of them turned to another and spoke a single word. It was the Aetheri word for storm. The Battle of Velshara began on a cold morning in the capital system of the Dominion, when 1,800 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and filled the sky with war. The Velshara were waiting. Jelkan had pulled every ship, every defense platform, every weapon system in his empire back to the homeworld. Over 2,000 warships formed a wall of steel and fire around the planet. Orbital fortresses, each one the size of a small moon, anchored the defensive lines with weapons powerful enough to crack continents. The surface of Velshara itself was covered in ground-based anti-orbital batteries, shield generators, and fortified positions that had been built over centuries to withstand exactly this kind of assault. It was the most heavily defended position in the galaxy, and the Velshara had built it to be unbreakable. Admiral Castillo studied the defensive array on her tactical display. Her officers waited in tense silence around her, watching the wall of red icons that represented the Velshara fleet. It was the largest concentration of enemy firepower they had ever faced. For the first time since the war began, The Velshara outnumbered the attackers. Captain Park spoke first. Admiral, their defensive formation is textbook. Multiple overlapping fields of fire. The orbital fortresses provide anchor points that prevent flanking. A direct assault would be costly. Castillo nodded. Good thing we are not making a direct assault. She opened a fleet-wide channel. All ships, this is Castillo. You know why we are here. You know what they did. Today we end this. Execute Operation Thunderfall. Operation Thunderfall was not a single plan. It was dozens of plans, layered on top of each other, designed to adapt to whatever the Velshara threw at them. It was the product of 6 months of human military planning, informed by every lesson learned since Cathara, and it was the most complex military operation in the history of the species. The battle began with deception. A third of the Terran fleet surged forward in what appeared to be a direct frontal assault, drawing the attention and firepower of the Velshara defensive line. The Velshara commanders, trained in a doctrine that valued head-on confrontation, committed their reserves to meet the charge. It was exactly what Castillo wanted. While the Velshara focused on the frontal assault, Submarine, the remaining Terran ships split into dozens of small groups and slipped around the edges of the defensive formation. They used the system's asteroid belt as cover, threading through gaps in the sensor network that human intelligence had identified weeks earlier. Some groups carried electronic warfare packages that jammed Velshara communications. Others carried special forces teams in boarding pods, ready to take the orbital fortresses from the inside. The first orbital fortress fell 4 hours into the battle. A team of human marines breached its hull through a maintenance hatch that the Velshara had never considered a vulnerability. They fought their way through the station's interior in brutal close-quarters combat, taking the command center and turning the fortress's own weapons against the Velshara fleet. And the effect was devastating. The defensive line cracked. By the end of the first day, 2 more fortresses had fallen. The Velshara fleet was in disarray, caught between the frontal assault and the smaller groups that were now hitting them from every direction. Jelkan ordered a retreat to a tighter defensive perimeter around the planet, but the withdrawal was chaotic. Ships collided with each other in the confusion. Communications were scrambled by human electronic warfare. Commanders could not reach their subordinates. The second day was worse. The Terran fleet pressed into the gaps in the Velshara formation with relentless aggression, widening every crack, exploiting every mistake. The Iridian ships, fighting alongside the humans for the first time in a major engagement, found themselves caught up in the momentum. Iridian captains, trained in the cautious, methodical doctrine of their own navy, watched in amazement as human ships charged directly into the strongest points of the Velshara line, absorbed terrible punishment, and kept coming. On the bridge of an Iridian cruiser, Sylphie witnessed something she would never forget. A human destroyer, badly damaged and venting atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches, positioned itself between a Velshara battleship and a crippled Iridian transport carrying wounded soldiers. The destroyer had no chance of surviving the exchange. Its captain knew it. Every officer on that ship knew it. They did it anyway. They held position for 11 minutes, taking hit after hit, buying time for the transport to limp to safety. When the destroyer finally broke apart, its last transmission was a single word from its captain. Clear. The transport made it to safety. 200 Iridian wounded survived because a human crew of 63 decided that their lives were worth the trade. Sylphie stood on her bridge and watched the debris of the destroyer drift through space, and she felt tears running down her face. She had not known she could cry. She was not sure Iridians were supposed to be able to cry, but she cried for those 63 humans who had died to save people they had never met, from a species that had spent 2 centuries pretending they did not exist. The third day of the battle broke the Velshara fleet. The last orbital fortress fell to a combined human-Iridian assault. The remaining Velshara warships, cut off from their command structure and surrounded on all sides, began to surrender in groups. Some fought to the end. Most did not. They were exhausted and terrified and beaten, and they had nothing left. By the 4th day, the space around Velshara belonged to the Terran fleet. The orbital battle was over, but the planet remained. Jelkan had retreated to the surface with his personal guard and his most loyal units. The Velshara capital city was a fortress in its own right, built into the bedrock of the planet, shielded by energy barriers and defended by millions of soldiers who would fight to the last. Taking the city by orbital bombardment would be easy. The humans had the firepower to reduce the entire surface to glass. Every military analyst in the galaxy expected them to do exactly that. After Elysium, no one would have blamed them. The Vel-Shara had murdered 12 million human civilians. The galaxy would have understood if humanity had repaid the debt in kind. Castillo gave a different order. No orbital bombardment, she said. We go down there and we take it on the ground. Park stared at her. Admiral, a ground assault on the Vel-Shara capital will cost tens of thousands of lives. We can end this in an hour from orbit. I know what we can do from orbit, Captain. The Vel-Shara showed us what that looks like at Elysium. We are not them. We go in on the ground. We take the city. We end this the right way. The ground assault on the Vel-Shara capital lasted 7 days. It was the bloodiest fighting of the entire war. Human soldiers fought through streets and buildings and underground tunnels, clearing every room, every corridor, every bunker. The Vel-Shara defenders fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, when knowing that their civilization's survival was at stake. The humans paid a terrible price. Thousands died in the streets of the capital. They died taking bridges and intersections and buildings that had no strategic value but had to be taken because the alternative was bombing them flat, and the humans refused to become what the Vel-Shara had become. On the 9th day, Vel-Shara Supreme Council, a civilian governing body that had been powerless during the war, emerged from their emergency bunker under a white flag. They broadcast a message of unconditional surrender to every Vel-Shara military unit on the planet and across the Dominion's remaining territories. Gel Khan refused to accept it. He retreated deeper into his fortified bunker complex beneath the city with 1,000 of his most fanatical loyalists and continued to fight. It took 2 more days to dig him out. When human soldiers finally breached the last door of the last room in the deepest level of the bunker, they found Gel Khan sitting alone at a table, surrounded by the bodies of his guards. He had not fought at the end. He had simply sat there, waiting. He looked up at the human soldiers who entered the room. They were dirty and bloody and exhausted, their armor scarred and dented from 11 days of continuous fighting. They pointed their weapons at him and waited for him to move. He studied them with his 4 glowing eyes. These were the creatures he had called insects, the primitives he had dismissed, the animals he had tried to break by murdering their children. They stood before him now, conquerors of his empire, and they looked at him not with triumph or hatred, but with the tired, steady gaze of people who had done a hard and terrible thing because it needed to be done. "It is over," said the squad leader, a young woman with blood on her face and steel in her voice. Gel Khan said nothing. He placed his hands on the table and allowed himself to be taken. On the 11th day of the Battle of Vel-Shara, the guns fell silent. And then humanity did the thing that no one expected. The galaxy had been holding its breath for months. Every species, every government, every intelligence analyst had been asking the same question. What would the humans do when they won? Would they occupy the Vel-Shara homeworld? Would they carve up the Dominion's territory? Would they demand reparations so severe that the Vel-Shara would be reduced to slavery? Would they do to Vel-Shara what the Vel-Shara had done to Elysium? The humans had every reason to be cruel. They had every justification for vengeance. The galaxy would have accepted it. The galaxy expected it. Admiral Castillo stood in the central plaza of the Vel-Shara capital, surrounded by the rubble of what had been the most powerful city in the Dominion. She looked at the destruction and the bodies and the shattered remains of a civilization that had tried to destroy her people. And she gave an order that echoed across the galaxy. All Terran forces, immediate cessation of offensive operations, weapons to safe status. Medical teams are to begin treating all wounded regardless of species. Engineering Corps will begin emergency infrastructure restoration. Supply ships are to distribute food, water, and medicine to the civilian population. This is not a request. This is an order. The response was confusion, not from the human forces, who executed the order with the same discipline they had shown in battle. The confusion came from everyone else. The Iridians, who had expected to divide the spoils of victory, were stunned. The Vel-Shara civilians, who had been hiding in shelters expecting to be slaughtered, emerged to find human soldiers handing out blankets and food. The Galactic Council, which had been drafting emergency resolutions to deal with the expected human occupation, sat in speechless silence. The Iridian High Command demanded an explanation. They wanted reparations. They wanted territory. They wanted the Vel-Shara punished for 63 years of war and the billions of Iridian lives that had been lost. They had earned it, they said. They deserved it. General Webb met with the Iridian delegation and listened to their demands. Then he shook his head. No. The Iridian fleet marshal turned purple with rage. No! We have fought this war for 6 decades. We have lost worlds. We have lost billions of our people. And you tell us no? Webb looked at him with tired eyes. Marshal, if we strip the Velshara bare, if we take their worlds and their wealth and their dignity, what do you think happens in 20 years? In 50? They rebuild. They remember. And they come back, angrier than before. We did not cross the galaxy and spend the lives of our people to plant the seeds of the next war. We came here to end this one. This is not your decision to make. It is exactly our decision to make. Our soldiers are the ones who took this planet. Our people are the ones who died to get here. And we did not do it so that you could become the next Velshara. The Iridians argued. They protested. They threatened. In the end, they accepted, because they had no choice. The human fleet was the dominant military force in the galaxy, and the humans had made their position clear. There would be peace. Not the peace of the conqueror, but the peace of the exhausted. The peace of people who had seen enough death. Castillo called for a galactic peace summit. Every species was invited. Every government, every faction, every voice that wanted to be heard. The summit was held on a space station in neutral territory, and it lasted for 3 months. The negotiations were long and difficult and often bitter. Old grievances were aired. New ones were created. More than once, the talks nearly collapsed. But through it all, the humans held firm. They brokered compromises. They mediated disputes. They used the threat of their military power not to dominate, but to keep everyone at the table. Castillo herself sat through hundreds of hours of negotiations, and she brought the same calm, unyielding determination to the conference room that she had brought to the battlefield. The treaty that emerged was not perfect, no treaty is, but it established the framework for a peace that had seemed impossible a year earlier. The Velshara Dominion was reformed, not destroyed. War crimes tribunals were established. Reparations were paid, but calibrated to rebuild rather than to punish. A new galactic security framework was created, with humanity as its anchor. Not because they had conquered the galaxy, but because they were the only species that every other species believed would fight to keep the peace. In the weeks after the summit, the transformation of the Velshara homeworld became the defining story of the post-war era. Human ships that had carried weapons now carried food and building materials. Human engineers worked alongside Velshara civilians to restore power and water to the damaged cities. Human medics treated Velshara wounded in field hospitals set up in the ruins. An image spread across the galaxy. It was a photograph taken by a Velshara journalist in the streets of the capital. It showed a human marine, still in his battered combat armor, carrying a Velshara child in his arms. The child was small and frightened, her crimson skin pale with shock, her 4 eyes wide with terror. The Marine was holding her carefully, showing her gently the way a parent holds a child. He was walking through the rubble toward a medical station, and his face, visible through his cracked visor, showed an expression that every species in the galaxy recognized instantly. Tenderness. This was the same species that had fought like demons for 11 days. The same species that had torn through the most powerful military in the galaxy with a ferocity that would be studied in war colleges for centuries. The same species that had been quarantined as too dangerous to exist among civilized peoples. And here was one of them, carrying an enemy's child to safety as if she were his own. The image became the symbol of the war's end. It was reproduced in every media outlet on every world. It was displayed in galleries and government buildings and schools. And it forced the galaxy to confront a truth that it had been avoiding for 200 years. They had been wrong about the humans, not wrong about their violence. The violence was real. The danger was real. Everything the quarantine reports had said about human aggression and human capacity for destruction had been confirmed 1,000 times over in the last year. The humans were, without question, the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever encountered. But the quarantine reports had missed the other half of the equation. They had cataloged the darkness and ignored the light. They had seen the wars and missed the rebuilding. They had counted the weapons and overlooked the hospitals. They had measured the capacity for destruction and failed to weigh the capacity for creation, for compassion, for love. H. Sylphie wrote her final report from a temporary office in the rebuilt Velshara capital. She had spent a year among the humans. She had watched them prepare for war and fight it and win it, and then, against all expectations, put down their weapons and pick up tools. She had seen the best and worst of them. She had been terrified of them, and inspired by them, sometimes in the same hour. Her report was long and detailed, full of military analysis and strategic assessment, and the kind of dry professional language that Iridian intelligence officers were trained to use. But at the end, she abandoned the professional language and wrote from the heart. We feared them because they were predators. We should have feared them because they were human. They carry war in one hand and mercy in the other, and they choose every single time which hand to extend. The galaxy locked them away because we saw only the war. We were fools. The mercy is what makes them truly terrifying, because it means the destruction they are capable of is not mindless. It is a choice, and they chose when they had every reason not to be kind. The galaxy will never be the same for having met them. I am not sure we deserve them, but I am grateful, more than words can express, that they are here. The report was classified for exactly 3 days before it was leaked. Within a week, it had been read by every sentient being in the galaxy who had access to a communications terminal. Sylphie's words became the most quoted passage in modern galactic literature, cited in everything from academic papers to children's school books. On a quiet evening, several weeks after the treaty was signed, Talvex stood on the observation deck of a human space station orbiting Velsharath. He was alone. The station was one of hundreds that the humans had deployed to coordinate the reconstruction effort. Below him, the planet turned slowly in the darkness, its surface still scarred but alive. Lights were visible in the cities. Ships moved in orbit. Life was returning. In a refugee camp on the surface, visible through the observation window as a grid of lights near the equator, Velshara and human children were playing together. Talvex could not see the details from this distance, but he had visited the camp that morning. He had watched a group of Velshara children, orphaned by the siege, chasing a human boy around a makeshift playground. The human boy was laughing. The Velshara children were making the high-pitched clicking sound that their species used for joy. None of them were old enough to understand what had happened. None of them cared that their species had been trying to kill each other a month ago. They were just children, playing together under a sky that was finally quiet. Talvex thought about the journey that had brought him here, the desperate mission to human space, the first meeting with Castillo in that gray conference room, the fear and the hope and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether he was saving his civilization or dooming it. He thought about Elysium and the silence that followed. He thought about the Battle of Velsharath and the choice that the humans had made in its aftermath. He thought about the quarantine. 200 years. For 200 years, the galaxy had kept humanity locked away in a corner of the Orion Arm. And in all that time, not one species had thought to ask the obvious question. Not what the humans were capable of destroying, but what they were capable of building. Now the galaxy knew, and Talvex suspected that the answer would reshape civilization for centuries to come. A sound behind him made him turn. Admiral Castillo had entered the observation deck. She was out of uniform, wearing simple civilian clothes, and she looked smaller without the weight of command on her shoulders. She looked tired. She looked old. She looked like a woman who had carried the fate of a species on her back and was only now beginning to feel the strain. She walked to the window and stood beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just watched the planet turn below them, so scarred and wounded and alive. "Do you regret it?" Talvex asked quietly. "Coming to our war?" Castillo was quiet for a moment. "I regret every life we lost, every ship, every soldier who is not going home. I will regret those things for the rest of my life." "But the decision itself!" She looked at him. Her dark eyes, which had been so hard and so cold in that first meeting, were softer now. Not weak, never weak, but human, in the truest sense of the word. "No," she said, "I do not regret it. Someone had to do it. Someone had to stand up and say enough. The galaxy was not going to do it. The council was not going to do it. So we did. You could have stayed behind your quarantine. You could have let us fight our own war. We could have, but that is not who we are. It never was. Well, your council looked at our history and saw a species addicted to violence. They were not entirely wrong, but they missed the point. We do not fight because we love war. We fight because we cannot stand to watch people suffer when we have the power to help. That is our curse and our gift, and it has been with us since the very beginning." Talvex thought about that. He thought about the 63 years of war and the billions of lives lost and the fact that it had taken a quarantined species of supposed primitives to finally end it. He thought about the children playing in the refugee camp below, Human and Velshara together, and he felt something rising in his chest that he had almost forgotten existed. For 63 years, he had lived in a galaxy defined by war, a galaxy where hope was a luxury that no one could afford. Sonam, a galaxy where the best anyone could do was survive until tomorrow and pray that tomorrow was not worse than today. Now, standing beside a human admiral on a station orbiting a world that had been the seat of the most powerful and terrible empire in the galaxy, watching that empire's children play with the children of the species that had defeated it, Talvex felt something he had not felt since he was a child himself. He felt hope, not the fragile, desperate hope of a man grasping at the last straw. Real hope, the deep, steady hope that comes from seeing the worst that the universe can do and watching someone choose freely and deliberately to answer it with kindness. The galaxy had feared humanity. They had locked them away and tried to forget them. They had called them predators and monsters and animals. And they were all of those things. But they were also the ones who, when the war was over and the enemy was beaten, and the whole galaxy expected them to take their revenge, reached out their hand instead. Not because they were weak, because they were strong enough to choose. The observation deck was quiet. The stars burned in the darkness outside. Below them, the lights of the refugee camp flickered like small, stubborn flames against the night. Talvex watched them for a long time. Then he smiled for the first time in 63 years. The galaxy had feared the predator. They should have understood the human.